Hi, I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm David Barton.
And we're here in Philadelphia. Behind us is Independence Hall. This is the place where the Declaration of Independence was actually constructed. When we celebrate the 4th of July, we're really celebrating the accomplishments from the building right behind us.
This is a birthplace of national freedom. And we're going to go all across the Northeast looking at the stories of those who gave us that freedom. We're going to look at their faith, we're going to look at their family, and we're going to look at their sacrifice. It's remarkable stories.
This is America's hidden history.
Modern historians have revised, rewritten, and even deleted entire chapters of American history. So what are we missing? What happened to the history that didn't make the books? Join historian David Barton, Tim Barton, and special guests as they uncover the facts some historians don't want you to know. This is America's Hidden History.
Behind me is Independence Hall, and this is where the 56 men were together when we did the Declaration. But you know, today, so few Americans know who actually signed the Declaration, what the Declaration's even about. We thought, let's just go on the street and find out, what do people actually know? Hey, I'm Tim.
Hi, I'm Susan.
Susan, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
Okay,
you.
we're doing a survey on the 4th of July. Why do we celebrate the 4th of July?
To celebrate America.
Greg. Nice to meet you, Greg.
Nice to meet
Okay, what do we celebrate on the 4th of July?
Independence.
From?
Slavery.
Cool, oh, Great Britain. Slavery was a little bit later. Hey, man, I'm Tim.
Hi, I'm Nick.
Nick, nice to meet you. What do we celebrate on the 4th of July?
Independence from England, yeah.
Okay, no, it's really good though. Many people have not gotten that right. My name's Tim.
I'm Marcus.
Do you know where the Declaration of Independence was signed?
It was signed in Boston, Massachusetts.
It's not a bad guess. Do you know where that was done?
No, I don't.
I don't know, I want to say Delaware.
It's a really good guess.
Hi, I'm Catherine.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, goodness. No.
Okay, that's okay. Do you know where the Declaration was signed?
I do. Pennsylvania?
Yes, Philadelphia. Okay, yeah, very good.
Tom Mullen.
Hey, Tom, nice to meet you.
Oh, that's a really tough one. So if it wasn't in Quincy, it had to be Philadelphia, huh?
That's exactly right,
Wow.
Philadelphia.
It was signed in Philadelphia.
Yes. Do you know where in Philadelphia?
Constitution Hall?
Okay, actually it was in that building right there.
Oh, okay. This building right here.
But you haven't been there yet, right? So
Right,
you're from out of town.
Right.
You didn't know that yet.
Okay.
So when you visit that, you would get that right next time. So as a parent, there's a lot of things we don't know about the signers of the Declaration, and a lot of things we need to learn. So there's a lot of ground we're going to cover today. My dad's going in one direction, I'm going another. We literally are covering ground, trying to learn and uncover some of these stories. Join us today as we discover this in America's Hidden History.
Just around the corner from Independence Hall is a small structure known as Carpenters Hall. Carpenters Hall is right behind me, and this is where the Founding Fathers first got together 2 years before they signed the Declaration of Independence. They met here at Carpenters Hall and they said, all right, what are we going to do? We're 13 colonies, we've been separate states. How do we join together? How do we respond to Great Britain? And so as they convened to do that, this was new for them because the guys from Georgia had never met the guys from Pennsylvania, and the guys from Massachusetts didn't know the guys from Virginia. I mean, this is the first time they get together. So they started the meeting, they opened it up, they convened, make sure they had all the people they needed. And one of the very first acts they did was they opened with prayer. But it's not the dinky little prayer like we would use at a city council meeting. This was serious stuff. They went right around the corner to Christ Church and got the Reverend Jacob Duché to come pray. And according to historical records, it looks like that opening prayer session ran for about 2 hours. But they didn't just pray. When you look at the writings of those who were there, like John Adams, who wrote his wife Abigail, he said that they also studied 4 chapters of the Bible that morning, and that God so spoke to them out of one of those chapters, out of Psalm 35, it changed their whole attitude on what might occur. So this is the starting place of what 2 years later led to the Declaration of Independence, and it starts with a strong act of prayer and faith.
Aaron, hey, nice to meet you. What was your name?
Alexis.
Alexis. Okay, thank you guys for doing this. Do y'all know how many people signed the Declaration of Independence?
20. 2?
It's a little more. Do you know how many people signed the Declaration?
No.
Do you know how many people signed the Declaration?
I'm gonna guess 5.
13.
13.
There were 13 colonies, but every colony sent people to sign it.
12.
Several.
Yeah.
I think a dozen. I'm not sure.
Under 20.
Okay, that's a good one. That's probably about, probably close to 60.
50.
No. How about, can I guess?
Absolutely.
54.
You are so close. Do you know how many people signed the Declaration?
It seems like 56 people.
Okay, now, we also probably should point out, where are you from?
I'm from Russia.
From Russia, and you already know more than most Americans do. That's great.
We talked earlier about Carpenter Hall, and at Carpenter Hall we mentioned that they opened that original session of Congress with prayer, and they did so with the Reverend Jacob Duché of Christ Church coming over to pray. Christ Church is where so many of the Founding Fathers attended church. As a matter of fact, 7 signers of the Declaration are buried here at Christ Church, and one of those signers is Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration from New Jersey. Francis, in addition to designing an early American flag that didn't catch on, he also was a federal judge appointed by George Washington, and on top of that, he's a church music director, he's a choir leader. He played the organ here at Christ Church. And this is actually a hymn book that he did. It's the first hymn book in American history to have musical notation in it. It's the Book of Psalms. He set the entire Book of Psalms to music, and this is the product of a signer of the Declaration who's a strong patriot and a strong Christian.
Do you know the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
The Declaration and the Constitution, I have no clue.
What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution? What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
Well, isn't the Declaration about life, liberty, and...
What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
Well, one was the Constitution was our own statehood when we separated from England, and the other one was.
What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
I mean, I know the Constitution has certain, like, I guess, way of life.
Well, the Declaration came before the Constitution.
Absolutely.
I know that. It was signed before that, and I think the Constitution was just the official. It seemed like the Declaration was the rough draft.
What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
So, well, the Declaration of Independence, we became independent from Great Britain.
Yes.
The Constitution was more of once we were independent, like what our rules and regulations or goals were, I guess?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
This is how we were going to operate as a government.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
We're in Virginia, which is where the final battle of the American Revolution took place, and this is the home of signer of the Declaration, Thomas Nelson Jr., who was key in that final battle in winning American independence. He was actually one of the younger signers of the Declaration, about 38 years old when he signed the Declaration, but he was a very wealthy man. I mean, this is a very elegant house for that period of time, and he was willing to use his wealth to help advance American independence, and it really cost him a lot of his fortune. Interestingly, in the early part of the Revolution, the British fleet is coming up the Chesapeake, and that's real close here, and they thought that, well, they're going to attack Virginia. Well, what happened was the fleet went on up to Philadelphia, and so the first part of the Revolution is really in the northern states. But by the latter part of the Revolution, the British Army is coming here toward Yorktown, and at the same time, the American general who became a traitor, Benedict Arnold, he has now switched over to the British. He's got a fleet of ships, and they're coming up from the other direction. So you've got all of the British forces amassing here at Virginia. And as that's happening, the call goes out that we need help, we need military, we need troops, we don't have enough in the Continental Army. You gotta remember that at the time of the American Revolution, when you have all these Americans say, hey, let's take on the British, and the British are the greatest power in the world, nobody thought they could win. I mean, we didn't have our own military. We had a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers and store owners, and we'll grab our squirrel guns and do what we can, but nobody thought they were gonna win, so nobody loaned them any money. And so as they're running short of troops and supplies, one of the calls goes out from the Continental Congress that says, we're asking young men across the colonies, young men who have any kind of wealth or fortune, to start being banker and bankrolling some groups of artillery and groups of cavalry, etc. And so what young Thomas Nelson did was he got here in Virginia and got a bunch of the young men together, and they brought their horses, and he bankrolled the entire regiment of cavalry here, came out of his pocket. Well, he did that, and they took that cavalry up and helped Washington up north, and then they come back south. And then as they're seeing all the British start to converge here, they recognize, you know, the British have got a lot of ships and a lot of fleets, and we really need some help. And so they get the French fleet to come, but we got to pay for that. It cost a lot of money. And so Congress went to Thomas Nelson and said, can you see if you can raise several $1 million there in Virginia to help pay for the French fleet to come? And so Thomas Nelson, wealthy, went to all the folks he knew who had money. Everybody said, there's no way we're giving money to the American government. These guys won't win. And so Nelson's like, well, would you give it to me? Well, yeah, we'll loan you money. And so Nelson put his own name on the line and got the money that was needed, but he did it personally at his own expense. So all of the stuff that he's pouring in, and by the way, he was so giving in nature that the state early made him the commander in forces of all the military in the state of Virginia. But in working with George Washington, it's interesting that in the middle of the Revolution, as they're seeing things progress, and we don't have funding, but we keep winning battles, George Washington writes Thomas Nelson a letter, and he says, Thomas, he said, the hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and must be more than wicked that hath not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. In other words, Thomas, if people have seen what you and I have seen here, and they don't feel an obligation to acknowledge God for what he's doing, they're just flat wicked. They've got no spiritual heart at all. And so that was kind of the tone. They kept seeing God pull all these things off. Thomas Nelson's house goes back to 1730. So we're surrounded with all these old houses, and because this is a nice house, guess where the British officers went? They went in the house. As a matter of fact, Thomas Nelson thought that General Cornwallis, the commander of the British forces, was in his own home, because this is where the principal officers were. So it comes time to chase the British out of Yorktown. So the American artillery's out there, and they're just firing away at the town, trying to get the British out. And as Nelson is watching all the artillery being fired down on town, he sees all these houses being hit, except his own house. And his house is where the British generals are, and nobody's hitting it. And he goes and asks the artillery guys, how come my house is not getting hit? And they said, sir, you're the governor. You're the one bankroll. We're not gonna hit your house. He says, yes, you will. You aim at my house. No, we're not gonna. So he started offering them money. Every cannon that would hit his house, he would give them money. And so, interestingly, he starts bombing his own house, and cannonballs went through the wall and killed some of the British, and so the British scoot out of here. And so here you have a guy who did so much more for the rest of us. And while people today say, oh, those wealthy guys, well, it may be one thing if you keep all your wealth to yourself, but he was willing to sacrifice all of his wealth for the good of the country. And it was really good that he was willing to do that, because without what he did to bankroll here, the final battle of the Revolution, Yorktown, we might never have won the British. So Thomas Nelson, and by the way, like the others you've seen, he too was a strong man of faith. Way back when this thing started, back at the Boston Tea Party, at the very front end of the Revolution, he's one of the guys who calls for a nationwide day of fasting and prayer. And so he did see God's assistance often throughout the Revolution, strong man of faith. But this is the home of young Thomas Nelson Jr., one of the wealthiest men in the Revolution, who was willing to give it all so that we could have freedom. Now, I mentioned how that Thomas Nelson was willing to turn the cannons on his own house when he found that they weren't hitting his house. And here's part of the evidence right here. You see that nice round pockmark right there? Right where a cannonball hit, and it just boom. And you find those pockmarks all over the sides of his house. The evidence that he was turning the cannons on his own house. Matter of fact, when you get over here, it's still got a cannonball right there in it. And the same is true up top. Another cannonball right up there, just all over the side of the house. you have the evidence of his willingness to give his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor, which is what he had pledged to do in the Declaration, and his house bears testimony to the fact that he was willing to keep his word. So you've seen something of the home and life of Thomas Nelson Jr. It's interesting to see what his contemporaries and his peers said about him. For example, this is from James Madison, also a Virginia founder. He said, General Nelson was excelled by no man in the generosity of his nature, in the nobleness of his sentiments, in the purity of his revolutionary principles, and in the exalted patriotism that he answered every service and sacrifice that his country might need. Thomas Nelson Jr.
I'm at Princeton University, and I'm standing in front of the house where the president of Princeton resides. Now, the reason I'm standing here is because during the founding era, one of the presidents of Princeton was actually a signer of the Declaration. His name was John Witherspoon. This is where he stayed during his term as president. And actually, John Witherspoon was a minister in Scotland. He was recruited by many founding fathers to come and be an influencer in America, specifically to come be the president here at Princeton. Now, when he got here, not only was he the president, he led the theological seminary, he also was the pastor here on campus. He goes on to sign the Declaration. And in the midst of all he's doing to help promote things in America, to help promote freedom, biblical values, he realizes, you know, a lot of people, even in the state of New Jersey, don't have their own Bible. So he's largely responsible for this work right here. It was a Bible done for every family in the state of New Jersey so they could have their own copy of the Bible. Well, he goes on as a preacher. He continues preaching. This is one of his volumes of sermons. In fact, he has a 4-volume set. He had a 12-volume set. He had a 15-volume set. He preached a lot of sermons. The reason I point that out is most people today don't know the Founding Fathers, but we often hear that they weren't religious. We have no idea that they were ministers of the gospel who signed the Declaration. Well, there sure were. In fact, they were presidents of universities, and John Witherspoon personally trained more founding fathers than any single other individual, than any other university, and this is the place where he lived when he was president of Princeton.
We're in Princeton, New Jersey, and this is the home of Richard Stockton. He's one of the signers of the Declaration from New Jersey. He was one of the most effective attorneys in this part of the state, actually was very wealthy, as you can tell from his home. But when he signed the Declaration, the British were after him just like they were after the other signers. And so when he believed that the British were coming through this area, he gathered up his family, he took them about 30 miles away to where he thought they'd be safe, but he ended up in the middle of a bunch of loyalists, that is, British supporters. One night they captured him, and they turned him over to the British. And the British put him in a prison ship. That prison ship, he was tortured and he was abused and mistreated and starved. And that prison ship had been a 64-gun British man of war, but they cut the masts off it, they took the cannons out of it, and they crammed 1,200 prisoners down underneath. And he was there with the others. It was horrendous treatment. When Congress found out about it, they went to George Washington and said, hey, go talk to the British general and see if that's the way they're going to treat prisoners, because if it is, we'll start treating the British prisoners that way. And the British said, no, no, you can have him back. But when he got back, his library had been burned by the British. He had one of the greatest legal collections in the state. They had taken his horses. They butchered his livestock. He had nothing but desolation when he got back. And so he's back and he has 6 kids. He's dying, he knows it, and he knows his kids are about to be fatherless. So what do you do? What he did was, in his last will and testament, he starts it, he says, as my children shall have frequent occasion of perusing this document and may wonder as to the beliefs of their father, he then went through and listed all the doctrines of Christianity, all the necessity of living a moral life, how it's important in this life, and that he just gave fatherly guidance to his kids that are about to be without their father. Great leader, great attorney. He was on the Supreme Court here in New Jersey, but a great story of Richard Stockton.
We're in Quincy, Massachusetts, actually at the home of John and Abigail Adams. Now, John and Abigail Adams, probably more notable names when it comes to the founding era, although probably most Americans couldn't tell a lot about their story. Well, John Adams specifically, he was born in 1735. He was a descendant of both Pilgrims and Puritans. So really cool family history, fun family tree. As a young man, he was very engaged in the culture around him, got involved in politics, decides he wants to become a lawyer and becomes a lawyer. He meets a young woman named Abigail Smith and thinks this one was really impressive. I need to know her more. Well, her father was one of the local pastors. John Adams becomes so impressed with Abigail, they end up getting married. Together they have 6 children, although one daughter actually died when she was 1 year old and one daughter was stillborn. So 4 that survived, one son goes on to become the 6th president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. But in 1770 was the infamous Boston Massacre. Now, there was already some tension with the Americans and British anyway, but when the massacre happened, it really brought unrest between the Americans and British. And the Americans were so frustrated, they wanted to execute the officer and the soldiers involved. Well, John Adams was a lawyer. In fact, he was a lawyer tasked with defending the British in this scenario, which no American was proud of. In fact, they were very frustrated, but John Adams did it with great integrity. Now, John Adams actually argued the case so well that the officer and the soldiers got off free, which again, no American was happy about, although they at least had the understanding and integrity to recognize it wasn't John Adams trying to defend them because he liked what they did. It was rather a condition of the law, and John Adams wanted justice. Well, the people actually supported John Adams enough that John Adams was then elected to become part of their General Assembly that same year. Well, shortly after that, 1774, is when there's the first Continental Congress. And this is where the very first time you have people from all 13 colonies coming together trying to figure out what's going on in the midst of the problems with the British. Well, it's during these congresses, as they're meeting together, John Adams actually proposes that George Washington be the commander-in-chief. He says that man from Virginia ought to be our commander. Well, as John Adams continues on, he stays involved in this political realm. In fact, he becomes known as one of the Sons of Liberty. In the midst of this, in 1776, he was put on the Committee of 5 that was tasked with drafting the Declaration of Independence. And although Thomas Jefferson really is the guy who did the writing of the Declaration, when they brought back the Declaration and presented it to the rest of Congress, John Adams was a chief advocate. He was the one encouraging the rest of the congressmen, we have to get this done. We need the Declaration, we need this now. So he became the leader on the floor of actually getting the Declaration passed. The following year in 1777, he was appointed by Congress to go over to Europe and actually spent the next many years in Europe trying to negotiate an end to the war with Britain, working with France, working in Holland. In 1788, he resigned his post in Europe and came back to America. Now, while he was in Europe, they actually did the Constitution. So he had nothing to do with the Constitution, although when he returned, he did write in favor, supporting the Constitution, said as great as what we need to do. Well, the following year, he becomes the first vice president of the United States under the first president, George Washington, and he serves in that post for 8 years. At the end of 8 years, he then was chosen to be the second president of the United States. Now, his vice president was Thomas Jefferson, and it was unique because at that point, you didn't pick your vice president. The vice president was the person who got the second most votes. So Thomas Jefferson had run against him, so they were not political friends. Well, at the end of his first term, Thomas Jefferson decides that he wants to be president and runs, and so John Adams loses in his bid to become a president for a second term. At this point, he decides 1801, he's going to retire from public life. He's served for so many years. He comes back to this home again in Quincy, Massachusetts. Well, even though they had great disagreements throughout their political career, at the end of their life, he and Jefferson became friends. Quite uniquely, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, July 4th, 1826, he and Thomas Jefferson, both being friends, both died on that day. On the morning of the 50th anniversary, John Adams wasn't able to get out of bed. His family, friends recognized this is probably the end of his life. They gathered around the bed and they asked if he would like to propose a toast. So John Adams raised his glass and his last words were, "Independence forever."
We're in Hopewell, New Jersey, and this is the home of John Hart, one of the signers of the Declaration from New Jersey. Now, he was actually one of the older signers. He was in his upper 60s when he signed the Declaration, and he was a favorite of all of his neighbors. Now, he had a farm here. There's 400 acres here. He loved farming. He loved being outdoors, and his neighbors loved him because he always did what was right. Matter of fact, they called him Honest John Hart, and they so trusted him that for nearly 20 years, they elected him to local offices in the state legislature, and he just did what was right time after time. Well, when he signed the Declaration of Independence, that certainly made the British mad at him, and so they wanted him, and they wanted him bad. When word came that the British were coming, he was in his house at the bedside of his wife who was sick and was dying. He had 13 kids. He had all the responsibilities of the farm, but the neighbors come and say, you got to leave. The British are just around the corner. You got to go. And his friends and neighbors get him out of the house just before the British arrive. And so as it turns out, his wife actually ended up dying. He wasn't there when she did. And the British hunted him for the next several months all over the state. And amazingly, he never spent 2 nights in a row in the same place. He would sleep in a cave or sleep under a creek bank. He even said that there were times he would crawl in where dogs were sleeping and sleep there with the dogs, like in a doghouse. And for a year, this man in his upper 60s was living in all this rough area, and the British were chasing him. Well, when the British finally left the area, he returns home. His kids have been scattered. His estate has been pillaged. All of his livestock has been butchered. It's just been desolated. And his wife is now gone. And it hurt him so much and really just weighed on him that he never recovered from it. He died before the end of the American Revolution, but he was a strong Christian man as well as a strong patriot. He was a Baptist, and that was pretty unusual in this part of the country at the time. And he actually gave the land to the Baptist church for them to have their meeting house and for them to have their cemetery. He's actually buried in that cemetery. Turns out that's the first Baptist meeting house that's built in America for a place of worship. So with John Hart, you have a signer of the Declaration who's a great patriot, strong family man, has a great sacrifice that he paid, and he's a strong man of faith. This is like many of the Founding Fathers.
Can you name anybody that signed the Declaration?
John Hancock.
Exactly. Yeah, he was. And who was John Hancock?
He was the president of Congress.
You're brilliant, right? You're so smart. Do you know anybody else that signed the Declaration?
Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin did sign. Okay, so we have 2. There's 54 left. Can you name anybody that signed it?
George Washington.
Was the commander of the military.
George Washington.
It's a really good guess. He was the commander of the military.
Well, Hancock.
Yeah.
Franklin?
Did?
G-Dubs? George Washington do it? Was he
So
involved?
he actually signed the Constitution. Can you name any people that signed it?
John Hancock.
Of course.
Thomas Jefferson.
Of course.
John Adams.
Yes.
George Washington.
Did
No.
the Constitution.
Hancock.
John Hancock, yeah.
John Hancock.
Absolutely.
John Hancock.
Absolutely.
John Hancock, who was born about 100 yards up the street from there.
Absolutely.
As we know, Robert Tree Payne, a fellow named Fairfield. I don't know if Benji signed it. I'm sure John Adams signed it.
Absolutely. All right, we want to welcome you guys watching today. Welcome the audience. Thank you guys for being here. We're going to start talking about signers of the Declaration as we celebrate 4th of July. Probably the most famous signature on the Declaration is this guy's up here, John Hancock, right? John Hancock's a name. Most people have seen the signature. Most people have a general understanding of the name, but probably not a lot about the person or the character. John Hancock was the president of Congress during the Revolution. He was one of the guys who was part of the Sons of Liberty, but he also became the first governor of the state of Massachusetts. Under the king appointed all the governors. So once we separated in 1776, at that point, all the states began electing their own leaders. Well, John Hancock was chosen to be the first governor of Massachusetts. And one of the things he did was a practice actually that goes all the way back to the time of the Pilgrims. And every spring, the Pilgrims would do a day of prayer and fasting, asking for God to send the rain, right? Help grow the crops. Well, every single fall, they would do a Thanksgiving Day, and let's thank God for what he's done. Well, John Hancock follows that up. In fact, this is one of the original John Hancock Thanksgiving proclamations. He had 22 different prayer proclamations as governor, calling on people to recognize God, to thank God for God's provision, for what God had done for them. Well, this one is actually a unique Thanksgiving proclamation because in this proclamation, it actually happens at the bottom it says, on the 8th day of November, in the year of our Lord, 1780. So it's 1780. What happened that year prior to this was actually the revelation of the traitor Benedict Arnold, where they find out the mission that's going on, this plot to overthrow Washington and West Point and really try to end the revolution. Well, one of the things he says is that we are thankful for the watchful providence and rescuing the person of our commander-in-chief and the army from imminent danger at the moment when treason was ripe and for execution. On he goes. What's interesting to me, though, is this isn't just some thing that every fall we have this arbitrary thanksgiving to God. He's actually noting specific details. So even like we would talk about in our life, what can we be thankful for? What has God done for us? He's literally looking at things happening around him and saying, we need to thank God for what God is doing. Well, that's what happened in the fall. He also has...
They did that with prayer and fasting. This is one of his prayer and fasting proclamations. You go through, he's got the state of Massachusetts praying and fasting for specific things. I mean, that's what you see in the fasting proclamations as well.
Well, and this is one of his fasting proclamations. And this is also interesting to me because not only is he calling them to fast, which certainly is a spiritual thing that Christians, right, we're kind of called to do at times. One of the things he says about this is that we need to implore the divine forgiveness through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, our Savior.
Ooh, that sounds Christian.
Yeah, that's a big deal because right today, everybody knows the name John Hancock, but most people have heard the founding fathers were atheists, or they're agnostics, or they're deists. Well, atheists, agnostics, and deists don't talk about the fact that we need the forgiveness through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, our Savior. Not only does he believe in Jesus, he's saying that we need Jesus in our life. We need that and recognizes him as Savior. Well, John Hancock is one of those names that certainly is well known. People don't know a lot about him. One of the cool things we actually have is there's been a reprint of a lot of those original prayer proclamations. So really fun, right? So if parents want to help their kids see some of these old things, or if you're a teacher or a homeschool parent, but there's a lot of these proclamations. So actually at wallbuilders.com, you can go and you can see some of these. But this is one of the examples from founding fathers, certainly names we recognize, but don't know much of their story.
Well, we don't know much of the story or even the culture back then, what happened, because as governor of the state of Massachusetts, where he issued these 22 proclamations, this is not quite as big as those proclamations, but right up top, it's got the big title that says Sermon. And then right under that, it says John Hancock. And it's not that he preached a sermon, it's that every year, the Governor Hancock, would bring in a preacher to preach to the entire state government. And so he and the lieutenant governor and the House and the Senate, they all get together, and that's how they started every legislative session, was with a preacher giving them guidance on, oh, if you're looking at education this year, here's what you need to know out of the scriptures. You're looking at taxes, here's what you need to know. Looking at military. So there's a lot of sermons with John Hancock's name on them because he brought preachers in and had preachers preach, which was a custom in Massachusetts and a lot of the northeastern colonies.
So not only was he a guy who was obviously open to faith and religion and doing proclamations as governor, he's a guy who says, I want to know what the Bible says. I want pastors come teach me. So he's also being mentored by pastors, which is also kind of a cool deal. We don't hear about today, but John Hancock, again, it's a name we know. We just don't always know a lot about him. Another name that is really well known today is Sam Adams, although probably the reason he's most known today is probably not really who he was and what he did. What do you know about Sam Adams? What's kind of the number one thing with the name association? Alcohol, right? He's the beer guy, right? That's what he's known as, although he had a different title. For generations, he was known as the father of the revolution. The reason he was known as the father of the revolution, he was the guy back early 1770s. He's already saying, we need to get the British off our backs. We need some freedom, this tyrannical king. He is already fighting for freedom on a lot of levels. In fact, one of the things that he was very heavily involved in, he's one of the guys who leads the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were well known for things like the Boston Tea Party, which actually...
And everybody knows what a tea bag is, and we think the Boston Tea Party, they threw a bunch of tea bags in the harbor. That's tea. This
is a tea block. So on the back, you actually can break off a block of it, and then you would scrape to get the amount of tea you need, right? And you can take that tea. Well, so the Sons of Liberty, they dressed up as Indians so as not to identify themselves, although I don't know how well they disguised themselves. Well, he took off his shirt, but that's still Sam Adams, right? Probably they still could find you. Nonetheless, they dress up and they're throwing blocks of tea into the harbor. Well, most people have heard of the Boston Tea Party. Well, Sam Adams, He and John Hancock were both leaders of the Sons of Liberty, but Sam Adams is really the guy helping lead a lot of this.
And, you know, you mentioned Hancock and Adams together, and they were both governors of Massachusetts, but there's a big difference between the guys. I mean, you got them here side by side. He's one of the wealthiest guys in America, hands down. Not him. I mean, he is so poor that when he got elected to the Continental Congress, he didn't even have a suit of clothes. His neighbors got together and took up a collection and said, let's buy Sam some socks and some new pants and a shirt. I mean, he's going to Congress. Let's have him.
Yeah, so literally, they said he's our best speaker. He's the one that will represent us the best. But the only suit he had is what he wore and had holes in it. He had a pair of stockings with holes in it. So they took up a collection. They bought him 5 pair of new stockings. They bought him a new suit. But then the problem is, he's still got to get from Massachusetts down to where Congress is meeting. So they actually wrote to his cousin, John Adams, and said, could your cousin borrow a horse? Apparently, they didn't even have a horse in the town they could loan him. They're using them to work on the farms. And so he has to borrow a horse just to be able to not have to walk to get to the Continental Congress. So, yeah, he's an example of, we often hear today, well, there were these really rich white guys. Well, there were some guys that were rich, but certainly that's a stereotype that's not accurate to all of them.
The Founding Fathers really were typical Americans. They were rich, they were poor, some were old, some were young. There were all sorts of denominations
lawyers,
among
doctors,
them.
teachers, farmers, across
everything.
the board.
So what happens is on the 4th of July is when Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. But the copy we see with all their signatures on it, that wasn't done until August the 2nd, because they said, hey, let's do a big one we can all sign, because the one on the 4th of July only has 2 names on it, and that's the President of Congress and the Secretary of Congress. But then they do this big one, and on the day they did that, August the 2nd, this piece is released. And this is a piece that is done by Sam Adams, attributed to Sam Adams. I'll just read you here. It says, an oration delivered at the State House in Philadelphia, which is where they did the Declaration, a very numerous audience on Thursday, the 1st of August, 1776, by Samuel Adams, member of the General Congress. This is the day before the big Declaration is generally signed. I want to read to you what Sam says here. What are they saying about this day and about the specialness of the day? He said, we have this day, and think of the significance of that day, we have this day restored the sovereign to whom alone men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven, and with a propitious eye beholds his subjects, affirming that freedom of thought and dignity of self-direction which he bestowed on them. From the rising to the setting of the sun, may his kingdom come. Pretty powerful statement for what they did on that day and what they were doing at that period of time. I mean, that's a really...
Especially recognizing that at that time, right, the king was generally recognized as being the sovereign, right? Appointed by God, representing God. And he says, no, no, we've put the actual sovereign back in place, right? That's who we're actually submitting to.
Well, the other Founding Fathers said that Sam Adams was the most openly Christian of all the Founding Fathers. I mean, he wore it on his sleeve, literally. He was what today we would call an evangelical, and people know that he was the beer guy, but they don't know about his faith.
Although it's very evident when you see their writings.
Yeah, another guy that's really key among the Founding Fathers is this one. This is Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Now, interesting, he signs the Declaration, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and that's because there were 9 Charles Carrolls living at the time in his area. So he's the one from Carrollton, and that's the town and area, and that's his place. And this is one of the documents from him, and this actually says, Mr. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, to the trustees of the Catholic Cathedral Church. He's the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. Now, this actually is, he's renting his pew. One of the ways you helped fund the church back then was not only in tithes, and today we have customs. If you go to church much, you know where people generally sit. Well, back then you actually kind of bought the seat where you sat.
So literally, that is my seat.
That is my seat. I paid for that seat. Leave. So that's one of the ways they funded. So this is for 3 months pew rental for a particular pew. But back then, we often again hear the narrative today that there was so much bigotry back then and they were anti-Catholic. The anti-Catholic sentiment was really because these guys will be against what we're trying to do by giving people the freedom to choose their leaders. Well, he certainly wasn't. He's a guy who signed the Declaration of Independence, who stood up against the king, and so he kind of broke the barriers, and they said, oh, look, there is a Catholic that is a pro-Republican Catholic. They want elected government, and so by the time we get to the Constitution, we have more Catholics actually signing the Constitution. So he kind of breaks through some things, and he lives to be really old. He died at the age of 95. Now, age of 95 is not that impressive today. But you need to know that the average lifespan back when they signed the Declaration was 33 years old. So he lives to be 95. And it's interesting that, you know, he kind of outlives his kids and grandkids, and late in life, they're kind of talking to him and said, Charles, you're going to die someday, and when you do die, are you ready to meet God?
Which is a good question.
This is his answer. This is a letter. Charles Carroll, this is 1825, which makes him 89 years old at the time, and am I ready to meet God? And he says, of course I am. He says, on the mercy of my Redeemer, I rely for salvation, and on His merits, not on any works I've done in obedience to His precepts. That's Ephesians 2:8-9. By grace are you saved through faith. And it's interesting, he was the wealthiest guy in America. I mean, he, hands down, wealthier than John Hancock. Interesting to see what he did with his wealth. He lived in a rural part of Maryland where they didn't have a lot of people, so you didn't have enough tithes to be able to have preachers all the time at the churches. So he took his wealth and he endowed a church there, permanently endowed the church and permanently endowed a preacher so that you would have a preacher to preach the gospel even when there's not enough people to be able to afford to get a preacher in. So he put his money into the gospel stuff as well. Again, great guy, great founding father.
And certainly another one of those guys who kind of breaks that religious narrative that the founding fathers weren't people of faith. And one of the guys who certainly was a man of faith. At the time of the founding fathers, he was probably one of the most significant founding fathers, at least according to John Adams. John Adams said that this founding father was one of the three most notable. He said the three most notable were George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and this guy right here, Dr. Benjamin Rush. Now today, Dr. Benjamin Rush is not a name that probably any American can tell you very much about unless they've specifically studied the signers of the Declaration and then they know his name. But he actually served on 3 different presidential administrations. He was director of the U.S. Mint. He started 5 universities. 3 of them still go today. He actually was known as the father of public schools under the Constitution. He was the father of American medicine. He came up with medical cures over 200 years ago that are still in use today. He was a very significant founding father, but today we just know so little about him.
He is a strong Christian founding father. In every sense of the word, he would be evangelical. Benjamin Rush is from Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania is largely a Quaker state. And so in 1774, they passed a law that said we're anti-slavery. Well, the king vetoed that law as well. And so when the king vetoed that law, he said, look, guys, you're part of the British Empire. You can't end slavery. That's when Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin said, let's not be part of the British Empire anymore. We want to end slavery. This actually is really an act of civil disobedience. This is the Constitution for the first abolition society ever founded in America. It goes back to 1774. We're still British colony, but these guys are saying, we're not doing this. Now, Benjamin Rush not only helps found the society with Ben Franklin, he goes on to become the leader of the national abolition movement. They started abolition societies all over the United States, states everywhere. They want slavery ended. So Benjamin Rush is a huge anti-slavery guy. He's also a guy who, like many founding fathers back then, would read through the Bible once every year, go through from cover to cover. And this happens to be his notes that he kept as he would read through the Bible and the Lord would show him things out of the Scriptures. He would make these notes and write down verses, and it's on various topics. So he's got verses that deal with animals, and he's got verses that deal with salvation and the efficacy of prayer and forgiveness. And so he just is in the Word all the time. And because he's in the Word all the time, he wants everybody else to have the Word. So he's the founder of the Sunday school movement. This is a newspaper from 1791, and it talks about the new Sunday school movement, and Benjamin Rush is one of the guys running the Sunday school movement, but he still wants that Word of God out there for everybody. So another way to do it is, like John Witherspoon wanted the Bible in the hands of everybody in New Jersey, Benjamin Rush said, let's just create a society that can give Bibles to everybody. And that's the Constitution for the very first Bible society ever started in America. And it's Benjamin Rush who has written the address there for all the people. And then in looking for a way to make sure that they could get Bibles, he came up with a new way to print Bibles called stereotype printing, kind of mass production. That's the first mass-produced Bible done in the United States. It's done, again, with Benjamin Rush's Bible Society. So really cool stuff he did in trying to propagate faith throughout the United States.
Well, one of the essays he wrote is this essay right here. It's called A Defense of the Use of the Bible in Schools. And you can guess from the title exactly what he's talking about. It was why we need the Bible in schools. Actually, in this essay, he gave a dozen or so reasons why the Bible was a necessity for the next generation. In fact, he warned that if we remove the Bible, we would spend time and money punishing crimes that we could have prevented had we instructed young people in morals. In fact, he goes on to write several essays, and a lot of them deal with education. This is a book of his essays. So in this, he talks a lot about the Bible and various other topics, but when he talks about the Bible, one of the things he says is that in America, he says the only useful education has to be laid in religion, specifically the Bible, because without religion, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty, and liberty is the object of our government. The point he makes is that we want to be free as Americans, but freedom only works if we have virtue or morality. But you only have virtue or morality if you go back to the Bible. And so he says, without the Bible, America will never be a free nation, but if we will teach the Bible, we can always enjoy freedom. And this is one of the things that's fun looking back on these guys. When you start to see their stories and get beyond just the generalization of, well, those were those old guys, or, you know, whatever the generalizations are, when you actually start studying their stories, you see not only were these real people who actually dealt with real things in their life, the vast majority of them were so pro-God, so pro-faith, knew we need the Bible in America, and knew that ultimately the Bible is the basis of freedom. Do you know anything about their faith?
No.
No? Do you know anything about their faith? Like, did they believe in God? Because we hear a lot today that are atheists, agnostics, and deists. So do you know anything about their faith?
No, I don't, but I would guess Presbyterian or Episcopalian is what I would guess.
There were a lot of them that were.
Okay.
So that probably we could say even a majority of them were. What do you know about their faith?
Well, the Quakers are pretty big and involved, right?
There were some Quakers. So Stephen Hopkinson was a Quaker.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a governor, actually.
And the Puritans, obviously, right?
Puritans were, yep, their ancestors.
The Catholics were in Maryland, but...
So do you think some of the founding fathers were people of faith? Will we make that deduction?
One nation under God, so yeah, right?
Okay, we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, specifically the 4th of July, the signing of the Declaration, things associated as we celebrate. And as we look at independence, a lot of people don't know a lot of the founding fathers. In fact, when I have the chance to speak in schools or colleges, I'll show a picture of the signers of the Declaration, and we'll say, okay, who can you name? And generally there's two names that stand out above all the others, and that's Benjamin Franklin and it's Thomas Jefferson. And generally we recognize them because they're known as kind of the least religious founding fathers. It's the way they're painted. But even for being the least religious founding fathers, they really weren't anti-religious.
No. You take Jefferson, for example. Jefferson, undeniably, I don't dispute, he's one of the least religious founding fathers, but least is a comparative term. Least is compared to what? I mean, if you have a room of preachers together, one of them is the least religious, that doesn't mean he's anti-religious. And so Jefferson, if you take Jefferson and say, okay, let's just look at public actions that he did. For example, while he's in office, in federal office, under George Washington's a great example. When he's under George Washington and they're building the Capitol, Jefferson, as Secretary of the State, starts church services at the building of the Capitol so that on Sunday, government folks are going to church where they're building the Capitol. Well, he then gets elected to be vice president under John Adams, and when he becomes president, he does an interesting practice of he goes to church for 8 years to the church at the Capitol that he helped start when he was vice president. So as vice president, they take every Sunday and they take the hall of the House of Representatives in Congress and turn it into a church building. And that's where Jefferson went to church for 8 years. And so Jefferson helped start church there. Well, when he becomes president, he also starts Sunday church services at the War Department, at the Navy Yard, at the Treasury. Now imagine this. You want to go to church in Washington, D.C.? Do I want to go to the Capitol? Do I want to go to the War Department? Jefferson's the one who starts churches in the government buildings.
Isn't he the guy that wrote a letter about the separation of church and states?
Yeah, but nobody reads that letter anymore.
I think we've misunderstood what he meant.
If we read the letter, we would see that separation of church and state means the government can't stop a religious activity.
Or can't compel you
That's
to
right.
a certain denomination, right? It can't compel you and say you have to be Catholic, you have to be Anglican, you have to be Baptist or Episcopal, but it also can't stop you from your religious activity, is how the First Amendment reads. When you look at the Declaration, okay, the Declaration was written by a 33-year-old man, which... So if you're younger, that might not seem impressive. If you're older, like, that's more impressive, right? A 33-year-old is where Jefferson is when he goes into Congress. He's the one on the Committee of Five, largely responsible for drafting the Declaration of Independence. And in it, he put a lot of unique thoughts and ideas that were not common practice of the time, where he says that all men are created equal. Well, under the king, under a monarch, that's not a common belief, but he said these are self-evident truths. Well, they're only self-evident truths if you know what the Bible teaches, right? That we are all God's kids, and therefore we've all been created equal in God's sight, even though the world and culture Jefferson lived in largely didn't recognize that. I mean, Jefferson is just not the guy we often hear and think about.
And faith was a part of so many of these guys. I find it interesting. There is a set of books here. This is from 1825. And it's the writings of Richard Henry Lee. Now, Richard Henry Lee is this guy right here that on the 7th of June, he's the guy who said, let's separate from Great Britain. Let's not be British colony anymore.
He makes the official congressional motion, we're separated from Great Britain.
And it's interesting because at that time, several things happened. One is Congress calls for a time of prayer. And by the way, Congress often called us to times of prayer. These happen to be national calls to prayer from the Continental Congress. So the Congress is calling the people to prayer. This is one. Here is another with Congress calling the people. Congress called the nation to prayer 15 different times in the American Revolution. We have all these guys together working, and their faith is very evident. And then Richard Henry Lee says, let's just go ahead and separate and be a separate nation. And at that point, Congress says, okay, let us back away from this a little bit. If we're going to write a declaration, let's get together what we're going to say to the world, so they get that prepared. And it's interesting that we voted to separate eventually, and declaration came out. But years later, the letters of Richard Henry Lee were collected by the grandson. And the grandson has all of Granddad's letters, and he brings it out in this 2-volume set. This is from 1825. And in reading the letters of Richard Henry Lee, he's reading letters from Richard Henry Lee to Washington, to Jefferson, to Benjamin Rush, to John Adams, to Francis Hopkinson. And after he's gone through so many of the letters of the Founding Fathers, I want you to hear what the grandson concludes in having gone through all these letters. He says, the wise and great men of those days, all these Founding Fathers, the wise and great men of those days were not ashamed to confess the name of our blessed Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, in behalf of the people as their representatives and rulers. They acknowledge the sublime doctrine of His mediation. Now, wait a minute. When I read all the writings of the Founding Fathers, man, are these guys Jesus guys. They on behalf of the entire nation, they talked about Jesus. So on 4th of July, which is where we are now, we celebrate Independence Day. We celebrate the principles in the Declaration. And how do you do that? How's the best way to celebrate and really to take responsibility for preserving those principles? It's interesting. That was the discussion that happened 200 years ago. When they approved the Declaration of Independence, John Adams wrote his wife Abigail 2 letters. Here are letters from John Adams to Abigail. And what happened on the day they did this, he was thinking ahead, how will future generations see what we just did today? And he starts predicting that I think they're going to want to celebrate what we did today. Now, here we are 200 and something years later, we celebrate what they did. But back then on the day they did it, he's saying, I think future generations will want to celebrate this. And so listen to what he told his wife Abigail about how to celebrate this Independence Day. He says, I'm apt to believe that this day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. He was right. He was a prophet. That's what we do now. He said, this day ought to be commemorated. He said it ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows and games and sports and guns and bells and bonfires and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Make a big deal out of this, fireworks, everything. Listen to this. He said, this day ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. The way you ought to celebrate the 4th of July is as a religious holiday, a day of devotion to God Almighty.
Well, still, right? We celebrate. We have the barbecue, right? Maybe we go to the lake. We do fireworks. We celebrate. But ultimately, not only do we celebrate freedom, the way to appreciate and enjoy freedom, he says, make sure we thank God for the fact that we have freedom. Right? Living in arguably the freest nation on earth, certainly one of the freest nations in the history of the world, that ought to be something every 4th of July. Not only do we shoot off fireworks, we go, Lord, thank you that you've allowed me to be in a place where I have freedom.
Now, that was 1776. Here's a 4th of July oration given in 1837. So now we're 61 years later, and this is given by John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. So now, 61 years later, how do we celebrate the 4th of July? And what's the big deal about the 4th of July? This is what John Quincy Adams says. Is it not that in the chain of human events, the birthday of the nation, 4th of July, is indissolubly linked with the birthday of the Savior? 4th of July and Christmas go together? He says it forms a leading event in the progress of the gospel dispensation. Is it not that the Declaration of Independence first organized the social compact on the foundation of the Redeemer's mission on earth, that it laid the cornerstone of human government on the first precepts of Christianity? He says the 4th of July took what Jesus did on his birth, and we've now brought it to America. So the principles that Jesus brought in the world is what the 4th of July brought to America. They saw the 4th of July as one of our top 2 religious holidays in America. That's a good thing to remember on the 4th of July.
In the midst of everything else we do on the 4th of July, one thing we ought to remember is what the Founding Fathers pointed to. John Adams says that we ought to be celebrating this as a day of deliverance, almost like when Moses leads the Israelites out, right? What do? We're going to stop and thank God that we now get to enjoy something not everybody in history's enjoyed. We're enjoying freedom, and so we ought to, on 4th of July, say, God, thank you for freedom. As we celebrate Independence Day, just like John Adams at the end of his life, he was able to raise a glass and offer a toast. I would suggest that as we celebrate Independence Day, that maybe it would be appropriate for us to raise a glass and toast independence forever.
Today, we've uncovered the individual and very personal stories of several signers of the Declaration of Independence. We discovered they were honorable men who sacrificed their fortunes, their families, their homes, and even their lives to secure for every one of us the freedoms we now enjoy and so often take for granted. But what we've seen and heard only scratches the surface. For more information about any of today's topics, or to get resources you can personally study for yourself, go to our website, wallbuilders.com, or go to the App Store and download the Wall Builders app. You can also like us on Facebook, or go to our YouTube channel and other social media. And be sure to stay tuned to TBN for more exciting chapters in America's Hidden History.